Hi, and welcome back to Higher Ed Now. I'm here with Steve Ludwig, regent of the University of Colorado, for part 2 of 4 financial questions trustees should ask. In Wisconsin, as you know, a couple years ago, the Board of Regents there of the university system found themselves asking questions of their own regarding unrestricted cash funds or the nature and the use of these funds. A very lively public discussion.
Oh, yeah.
Do you find this to be a common occurrence? Is this something that...
We talked about in the last one. I asked some questions at the university. Those questions led to a lot more questions, and I found that we had a lot of money in our unrestricted fund account. And I was wondering, well, what's all this money? So restricted cash is what you have to spend based on either what the donor said, gave you the money, or if like you have a research grant, you have to spend it on that. Other cash funds are just like you can use them at your discretion. But the concern is when the numbers get really big, is this something the board has approved or hasn't approved yet? So if the university is saving money for a thing that they want to do, which means they're not spending the money elsewhere, we're not using the money to keep tuition down, we're not spending that money on other priorities, that should be explained to the board. Why are you putting $10 million in that fund? Why is there $100 million in that fund? So the board should be aware of what that unrestricted cash fund is and what it's for, and ask the questions. Is it aligned with our values? Is it aligned with our strategic plan? Is this wishful thinking? Should that money be used for other priorities? I think those are all legitimate conversations. And sometimes the cash balance doesn't show up when you get presented the annual budget.
Well, how does the availability of these resources affect decision on tuition, for instance?
Well, it would depend. So if you had an honest conversation and a forthright conversation with your campus leaders, you could make a decision. Do we need to save $10 million for a building, or should that go to something else because we're in a crisis? And that's a legitimate conversation. And the board might say, you know what? That's a strategic investment we absolutely have to do. But the conversation needs to take place. It can't be, yeah, we're not coming to you and being, now, did you remember we got $50 million in this other account? If they're not saying that, they're not being straight.
About a year ago, ACTA came out with a report looking at the top state flagship universities, and we found just many examples of trends and increases in athletic spending and in administrative expenditure. How does a board get on top of these type of issues using policy and questions?
I think you should separate the two. Athletics is its own beast. Anyone that says we're not in the professional athletics business is delusional. There is no way that schools can keep competing, building these temples of shiny objects to appeal to 17-year-olds, and we won't be able to afford it. It's an arms race. Someone's going to have to cry uncle.
Well, how does that get to the question of, did we approve this? I mean, what can trustees do to...
They could say, we're not going to approve a coach's salary. They could say, we're not going to approve a coach's payout thing. But then, guess what? You're not playing in the big leagues anymore. You're out. You're out of the game. So can you be responsible and say, you know what? We can't play this game anymore, and we know we're going to upset a lot of people.
Well, what about the administrative side?
Sometimes you just say, all right, people that make over this, they're not getting a raise this year. We did a cutoff. No, you can't do that forever. It's not fair. But sometimes in your tight budget times, the top people that are in charge of the institution that are running it, unlike a company, shouldn't get rewarded when times are tough, right? And so it's a way to share the pain. So
in closing, what advice would you give trustees who are coming in, a newly appointed trustee coming into a situation where they're having to deal with all these types of balance sheets with which they're not familiar? How do they get themselves acquainted?
If they're not familiar with higher education, they need to be kind to themselves and know that it's going to take a year or so to get up to speed, if not longer. That doesn't mean they shouldn't ask hard questions. That doesn't mean they shouldn't do what they think you should do. They should ask a lot of questions.
Well, any resources you'd recommend?
Well, I think ACTA is a great one. I think, this thing, I don't know if you've heard of it, called Google. That's a joke. Like Lumina Foundation is good. And there's huge foundations that are highly reputable, ACTA being one of them, that has resources that can say, oh, okay, I didn't know about this. I didn't know about this issue. Here's what I can do to look around. Your local bookstore. There's some great higher ed stuff. Derek Bach was really helpful for me, former president of Harvard, talks about some challenges, and he helped shed some light on, oh, here's what happens that they never tell us about in higher ed culture, and I wouldn't know because I'm not a faculty member. And he talks about that openly, very helpful, because he loves higher education and he wants to make it better. I love higher education, and I want to make it available to more people so they can get what I got. And so that's what the reform, for me, anytime we talk about reform, it's about how do we take this great, amazing thing that we get to do and make it available to more people and change more lives.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to our next conversation for our final segment in this series, talk about just other questions that may come up outside of the specific 4 financial questions.
Great.